The Great Depression, a terrible time for industry, but the golden age of the automobile. After the stock market crash of 1929, U.S. economy and global economy began a downward spiral. In the auto industry, the best-selling brands went from selling about 1 million units a year in 1930 to selling less than 200,000 a year in 1932. In fact, 1932 total U.S. production was less than 1.5 million. Companies tried to compensate for this by offering more for less. More features, more styling, more power. Chevrolet upgraded from a 4-cylinder to a 6-cylinder, so naturally, Ford upgraded from a 4-cylinder to an 8-cylinder. Many luxury brands were offering supercharged 8s at the time. Packard, Cadillac, and Lincoln offered a V12, Marmon and Cadillac a V16. Companies like Willys and Studebaker moved from the mid-price segment to the entry-level segment. Hudson's entry-level division Essex offered a new, smaller Terraplane. Within a few years, the Terraplane was the only Essex model. Then the Essex name was dropped, and then Terraplane was merged into Hudson itself. At GM, the Oldsmobile and Buick companion makes, Viking and Marquis, didn't survive their second year. Oakland was phased out, being completely replaced by the much cheaper Pontiac. LaSalle survived till the end of the decade before it was squeezed out by Cadillac. The only company that didn't seem to be impacted by the Great Depression was Auburn Duesenberg. None of these brands were ever big sellers. Of the three, Auburn was the biggest seller, and on its best year, it barely sold 40,000 models. But during the Depression, it went from 25th in sales to 16th in sales. Cord was barely introduced before the Depression started, but it was a technological marvel that offered features such as front-wheel drive, semi-automatic transmission, supercharged straight 8, and towards the end even pop-up headlights. So it was nothing but a bonus to the company. Then of course you have Duesenberg. Duesenberg was never about sales. Typically annual sales were measured in double digits. But during the Depression, Duesenberg made more money than ever. And people paid exorbitant prices for these cars, but what you got was a doozy. The base engine had 3 times the power of a Ford V8, and the higher-end models had nearly twice as much power as their closest competitors. Of course, none of this stopped them from closing their doors in 1937. And they weren't alone. A lot of prestige brands disappeared. Peerless, Pierce Arrow, Marmon. In addition to cars offering more power for less money, they were also offering more features. Features like front and rear bumpers, pneumatic tires, 2-piece windshield, and grills. It's hard to believe, but previously a grill was an aftermarket item that you purchased and mounted on your car to protect your radiator. But by this time, they were becoming part of the normal styling of the car. And the stylings of the cars really changed during this period. They went from being basically upright vehicles to being long flowing lines with pontoon fenders. In fact, some of the styling of these cars could be considered Art Deco, particularly in Europe and specifically in France, from brands like Delahaye and Delage and Talbot and Peugeot and, of course, Bugatti. The real step forward, however, was the streamliners. Some companies were actually starting to use wind tunnel testing to make these cars more aerodynamic. Of course, they were clay models in miniature wind tunnels. The first car that we saw to take benefit of this were the Chrysler Airflows from 1934 to 1936. The aerodynamics on these cars was improved enough that it actually improved the gas mileage of the car with the same mechanicals underneath it. And even though the car was very cutting edge, it was also too radical of a design for most buyers and was sort of a flop. There were also some attempts during this period to introduce some new smaller cars to the market. American Austin arrived in the U.S. in 1930, but these small cars struggled here and within a few years was restructured as American Bantam. We also saw the introduction of the American mini car, the Crosley. We should also probably mention the popularization of planned obsolescence. This was something that was developed during the restructuring of General Motors under Alfred Sloan, and the idea was quite simple. Offer regular updates, even if they're cosmetic, to make the model that you just got seem obsolete, to encourage you to buy another one again. Sort of like Apple does with the iPhone, iPad, everything. What this evolved into was the model year. So each year you got a new model with updates, whether they were cosmetic or mechanical. Some even went so far, particularly at GM, to rename the car every year. Oldsmobile tried to simplify this process by including the year in the model name. For example, if you bought a 1935 Oldsmobile, the base model would be an F35 and the high-end model would be an L35. Whether any of this actually helped with sales, I can't say. Eventually, all brands would adopt the model year, with the exception of Packard, which says they never adopted the model year, but a lot of their series tended to coincide with new model years. Their mentality was, well, update it when it needs updating. By the end of the decade, the economy seemed to be recovering, and part of this, at least, was due to the war in Europe. But that will be something we'll talk about in our next video.